Chapter 51. Enlightened. When Mr. Woodcourt arrived in London, he went, that very same day, to Mr. Vholes in Symonds' Inn, for he never once, from the moment when I entreated him to be a friend to Richard, neglected or forgot his promise. He had told me that he had accepted the charge as a sacred trust, and he was ever true to it in that spirit. He found Mr. Vholes in his office, and informed Mr. Vholes of his agreement with Richard that he should call there to learn his address. "Just so, sir," said Mr. Vholes. "Mr. C.'s address is not 100 miles from here. Would you take a seat, sir?" Mr. Woodcourt thanked Mr. Vholes, but he had no business with him beyond what he had mentioned. "Just so, sir. I believe, sir," said Mr. Vholes, still quietly insisting on the seat by not giving the address, "that you have influence with Mr. C. Indeed, I am aware that you have." "I was not aware of it myself," returned Mr. Woodcourt, "but I suppose you know best." "Sir," rejoined Mr. Vholes, self-contained as usual, voice and all, "it is a part of my professional duty to know best. It is part of my professional duty to study and to understand a gentleman who confides his interest to me. In my professional duty I shall not be wanting, sir, if I know it. I may with the best intentions be wanting it without knowledge, but not if I know it, sir." Mr. Woodcourt again mentioned the address. "Give me leave, sir," said Mr. Vholes. "Bear with me a moment, sir. Mr. C. is playing for a considerable stake, and cannot play without, need I say what?" "Money, I presume." "Sir," said Mr. Vholes, "to be honest with you, honesty being my golden rule whether I gain by it or lose, and I find that I generally lose, money is the word. Now, sir, upon the chances of Mr. C.'s game, I express to you no opinion. No opinion. It might be highly impolitic in Mr. C., after playing so long and so high, to leave off. It might be the reverse. I say nothing. No, sir," said Mr. Vholes, bringing his hand flat down upon his desk in a positive manner. "Nothing." "You seem to forget," returned Mr. Woodcourt, "that I ask you to say nothing, and have no interest in anything you say." "Pardon me, sir," retorted Mr. Vholes, "you do yourself an injustice." "No, sir, pardon me, you shall not. You shall not in my office, if I know it, do yourself an injustice. You are interested in anything and in everything that relates to your friend. I know human nature much better, sir, than to admit for an instant that a gentleman of your appearance is not interested in whatever concerns his friend." "Well," replied Mr. Woodcourt, "that may be. I am particularly interested in his address." "The number, sir," said Mr. Vholes parenthetically, "I believe I have already mentioned. If Mr. C. is to continue to play for this considerable stake, sir, he must have funds. Understand me. There are funds in hand at present. I ask for nothing. There are funds in hand. But for the onward play, more funds must be provided, unless Mr. C. is to throw away what he has already ventured, which is wholly and solely a point for his consideration. This, sir, I take the opportunity of stating openly to you, as the friend of Mr. C. Without funds, I shall always be happy to appear and act for Mr. C. to the extent of all such costs as are safe to be allowed out of the estate. Not beyond that. I could not go beyond that, sir, without wronging someone. I must either wrong my 3 dear girls or my venerable father, who is entirely dependent on me in the Vale of Taunton, or someone. Whereas, sir, my resolution is, call it a weakness or a folly if you please, to wrong no one." Mr. Woodcourt rather sternly rejoined that he was glad to hear it. "I wish, sir," said Mr. Vholes, "to leave a good name behind me. Therefore I take every opportunity of openly stating to a friend of Mr. C. how Mr. C. is situated. As to myself, sir, the labourer is worthy of his hire. If I undertake to put my shoulder to the wheel, I do it, and I earn what I get. I am here for that purpose. My name is painted on the door outside with that object." "And Mr. Carstone's address, Mr. Vholes?" "Sir," returned Mr. Vholes, "as I believe I have already mentioned, it is next door, on the second story. You will find Mr. C.'s apartments. Mr. C. desires to be near his professional adviser, and I am far from objecting, for I court inquiry. Upon this, Mr. Woodcourt wished Mr. Vholes good day, and went in search of Richard, the change in whose appearance he began to understand now but too well. He found him in a dull room, fadily furnished, much as I had found him in his barrack room but a little while before, except that he was not writing, but was sitting at a book before him, from which his eyes and thoughts were far astray. As the door chanced to be standing open, Mr. Woodcourt was in his presence for some moments without being perceived, and he told me that he never could forget the haggardness of his face and the dejection of his manner before he was aroused from his dream. "Woodcourt, my dear fellow," cried Richard, starting up with extended hands, "you come upon my vision like a ghost." "A friendly one," he replied, "and only waiting, as they say ghosts do, to be addressed. How does the mortal world go?" They were seated now near together. "Badly enough and slowly enough," said Richard, speaking at least for my part of it. "What part is that?" "The Chancery part." "I never heard," returned Mr. Woodcourt, shaking his head, "of its going well yet." "Nor I," said Richard moodily. "Who ever did?" He brightened again in a moment, and said with his natural openness, "Woodcourt, I should be very sorry to be misunderstood by you, even if I gained by it in your estimation. You must know that I have done no good thing this long time. I have not intended to do much harm, but I seem to have been capable of nothing else. It may be that I should have done better by keeping out of the net into which my destiny has worked me, but I think not, though I dare say you will soon hear, if you have not already heard, a very different opinion. To make short of a long story, I am afraid I have wanted an object, but I have an object now, or it has me, and it's too late to discuss it. Take me as I am, and make the best of me." "A bargain," said Mr. Woodcourt. "Do as much by me in return." "Oh, you," returned Richard, "you can pursue your art for its own sake, and can put your hand upon the plough and never turn, and can strike a purpose out of anything. You and I are very different creatures." He spoke regretfully, and lapsed for a moment into his weary condition. "Well, well," he cried, shaking it off, "everything has an end. We shall see. So you will take me as I am, and make the best of me?" "Ay, indeed I will." They shook hands upon it laughingly, but in deep earnestness. I can answer for one of them with my heart of hearts. "You come as a godsend," said Richard, "for I have seen nobody here yet but Vholes. Woodcourt, there is one subject I should like to mention, for once and for all, in the beginning of our treaty. You can hardly make the best of me if I don't. You know, I dare say, that I have an attachment to my cousin Ada." Mr. Woodcourt replied that I had hinted as much to him. "Now, pray," returned Richard, "don't think me a heap of selfishness. Don't suppose that I am splitting my head and half breaking my heart over this miserable chancery suit for my own rights and interests alone. Ada's are bound up with mine. They can't be separated. Vholes works for both of us. Do you think of that?" He was so very solicitous on this head that Mr. Woodcourt gave him the strongest assurances that he did him no injustice. "You see," said Richard, with something pathetic in his manner of lingering on the point, though it was off-hand and unstudied, "to an upright fellow like you, bringing a friendly face like yours here, I cannot bear the thought of appearing selfish and mean. I want to see Ada righted, Woodcourt, as well as myself. I want to do my utmost to right her, as well as myself. I venture what I can scrape together to extricate her, as well as myself. Do I beseech you, think of that." Afterwards, when Mr. Woodcourt came to reflect on what had passed, he was so very much impressed by the strength of Richard's anxiety on this point, that in telling me generally of his first visit to Symonds' Inn, he particularly dwelt upon it. It revived a fear I had before that my dear girl's little property would be absorbed by Mr. Vholes, and that Richard's justification to himself would be sincerely this. It was just as I begun to take care of Caddy that the interview took place, and I now returned to the time when Caddy had recovered, and the shade was still between me and my darling. I proposed to Ada that morning that we should go and see Richard. It a little surprised me to find that she hesitated, and was not so radiantly willing as I had expected. "My dear," said I, "you have not had any differences with Richard since I have been so much away?" No, Esther. Not heard of him, perhaps, said I. Yes, I have heard of him, said Ada. Such tears in her eyes, and such love in her face, I could not make my darling out. Shall I go to Richard's by myself? I said. No, Ada thought I had better not go by myself. Would she go with me? Yes, Ada thought she had better go with me. Shall we go now? Yes, let us go now. Well, I could not understand my darling with the tears in her eyes and the love in her face. We were soon equipped and went out. It was a sombre day, and drops of chill rain fell at intervals. It was one of those colourless days when everything looks heavy and harsh. The houses frowned at us, the dust rose at us, the smoke swooped at us. Nothing made any compromise about itself, or wore a softened aspect. I fancied my beautiful girl quite out of place in the rugged streets, and I thought there were more funerals passing along the dismal pavements than I had ever seen before. We had first to find Symonds Inn. We were going to inquire in a shop, when Ada said she thought it was near Chancery Lane. We are not likely to be far out, my love, if we go in that direction, said I. So to Chancery Lane we went, and there, sure enough, we saw it written up, Symonds Inn. We had next to find out the number, or Mr. Vole's office will do, I recollected, for Mr. Vole's office is next door, upon which Ada said perhaps that was Mr. Vole's office in the corner there, and it really was. Then came the question of which of the two next doors. I was going for the one, and my darling was going for the other, and my darling was right again. So we went up to the second story, when we came to Richard's name in great white letters on a hearse-like panel. I should have knocked, but Ada said perhaps we'd better turn the handle and go in. Thus we came to Richard, poring over a table covered with dusty bundles of papers, which seemed to me like dusty mirrors, reflecting his own mind. Wherever I looked, I saw the ominous words that ran in it repeated, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. He received us very affectionately, and we sat down. If you'd come a little earlier, he said, you would have found Woodcourt here. There never was such a good fellow as Woodcourt is. He finds time to look in between whiles, when anybody else with half his work to do would be thinking about not being able to come. And he's so cheery, so fresh, so sensible, so earnest, so everything that I am not, that the place brightens whenever he comes and darkens whenever he goes again. God bless him, I thought, for his truth to me. He's not so sanguine, Ada, continued Richard, casting his dejected look over the bundles of papers, as Vholes and I are usually, but he's only an outsider, and is not in the mysteries. We have gone into them, and he has not. He can't be expected to know much of such a labyrinth. As his look wandered over the papers again, and he passed his two hands over his head, I noticed how sunken and how large his eyes appeared, how dry his lips were, and how his fingernails were all bitten away. Is this a healthy place to live in, Richard, do you think? Said I. Why, my dear Minerva, answered Richard with his old gay laugh, it's neither a rural nor a cheerful place, and when the sun shines here, you may lay a pretty heavy wager that it is shining brightly in an open spot. But it's well enough for the time. It's near the offices and near Vholes. Perhaps, I hinted, a change from both. Might do me good, said Richard, forcing a laugh as he finished the sentence. I shouldn't wonder, but it can only come in one way now, in one or two ways, I should rather say. Either the suit must be ended, Esther, or the suitor. But it shall be the suit, my dear girl, the suit, my dear girl. The latter words were addressed to Ada, who was sitting nearest to him. Her face being turned away from me and towards him, I could not see it. "We are doing very well," pursued Richard. "Vholes will tell you so. We are really spinning along. Ask Vholes. We are giving them no rest. Vholes knows all their windings and turnings, and we are upon them everywhere. We have astonished them already. We shall rouse up that nest of sleepers. Mark my words." His hopefulness had long been more painful to me than his despondency. It was so unlike hopefulness, had something so fierce in its determination to be it, was so hungry and eager, and yet so conscious of being forced and unsustainable, that it had long touched me to the heart. But the commentary upon it now, indelibly written in his handsome face, made it far more distressing than it used to be. I say indelibly, for I felt persuaded that if the fatal cause could have been for ever terminated, according to his brightest visions in that same hour, the traces of the premature anxiety, self-reproach, and disappointment it occasioned in him would have remained upon his features to the hour of his death. "The sight of our dear little woman," said Richard, Ada still remaining silent and quiet, "is so natural to me, and her compassionate face is so like the face of old days." "Ah, no, no," I smiled, and shook my head. "So exactly like the face of old days," said Richard in his cordial voice, and taking my hand with a brotherly regard which nothing ever changed, "that I can't make pretences with her. I fluctuate a little, that's the truth. Sometimes I hope, my dear, sometimes I don't quite despair, but nearly I get," said Richard, relinquishing my hand and walking across the room, "so tired." He took a few turns up and down and sunk upon the sofa. "I get," he repeated gloomily, "so tired. It's such a weary, weary work." He was leaning on his arm, saying these words in a meditative voice, and looking at the ground when my darling rose, put off her bonnet, kneeled down beside him with her golden hair falling like sunlight on his head, clasped her two arms round his neck, and turned her face to me. Oh, what a loving and devoted face I saw! "Esther, dear," she said very quietly, "I'm not going home again." A light shone in upon me all at once. "Never any more. I'm going to stay in with my dear husband. We have been married above 2 months. Go home without me, my own Esther. I shall never go home any more." With those words my darling drew his head down on her breast and held it there, and if ever in my life I saw a love that nothing but death could change, I saw it then before me. "Speak to Esther, my dearest," said Richard, breaking the silence presently. "Tell her how it was." I met her before she could come to me and folded her in my arms. We neither of us spoke, but with her cheek against my own I wanted to hear nothing. "My pet," said I, "my love, my poor, poor girl." I pitied her so much. I was very fond of Richard, but the impulse that I had upon me was to pity her so much. "Esther, will you forgive me? Will my cousin John forgive me?" "My dear," said I, "to doubt it for a moment is to do him a great wrong. And as to me, why, as to me, what had I to forgive?" I dried my sobbing darling's eyes and sat beside her on the sofa, and Richard sat on my other side. And while I was reminded of that so different night when they had first taken me into their confidence and had gone on in their own wild, happy way, they told me between them now how it was. "All I had was Richard's," Ada said, "and Richard would not take it, Esther. And what could I do but be his wife when I loved him dearly?" "And you were so fully and so kindly occupied, excellent Dame Durden," said Richard, "that how could we speak to you at such a time? And besides, it was not a long considered step. We went out one morning and were married." "And when it was done, Esther," said my darling, "I was always thinking of how to tell you, and what to do for the best. And sometimes I thought you ought to know it directly, and sometimes I thought you ought not to know it, and keep it from my cousin John. And I could not tell what to do, and I fretted very much. How selfish I must have been not to have thought of this before. I don't know what I said now. I was so sorry, and yet I was so fond of them, and so glad that they were fond of me. I pitied them so much, and yet I felt a kind of pride in their loving one another. I never had experienced such painful and pleasurable emotion at one time, and in my own heart I did not know which predominated. But I was not there to darken their way. I did not do that. When I was less foolish and more composed, my darling took her wedding ring from her bosom and kissed it and put it on. Then I remembered last night, and told Richard that ever since her marriage she had worn it at night when there was no one to see. Then Ada blushingly asked me how did I know that, my dear. Then I told Ada how I had seen her hand concealed under her pillow, and had little thought why. My dear. Then they began telling me how it was all over again, and I began to be sorry and glad again, and foolish again, and to hide my plain old face as much as I could, lest I should put them out of heart. Thus the time went on, until it became necessary for me to think of returning. When that time arrived, it was the worst of all, for then my darling completely broke down. She clung round my neck, calling me by every dear name she could think of, and saying what should she do without me? Nor was Richard much better, and as for me, I should have been the worst of the three if I had not severely said to myself, "Now, Esther, if you do, I'll never speak to you again." "Why, I declare," said I never saw such a wife. Don't you think she loves her husband at all? Here, Richard, take my child for goodness' sake." But I held her tight all the while, and could have wept over her I don't know how long. "I give this dear young couple notice," said I, "that I am only going away to come back to morrow, and I shall always be coming backwards and forwards until Symonds Inn is tired of the sight of me. So I shall not say good bye, Richard, for what would be the use of that, you know, when I am coming back so soon?" I had given my darling to him now, and I meant to go, but I lingered for one more look of the precious face which seemed to rive my heart to turn from. So I said in a merry, bustling manner that unless they gave me some encouragement to come back, I was not sure that I could take that liberty, upon which my dear girl looked up, faintly smiling through her tears, and I folded her lovely face between my hands and gave it one last kiss, and laughed and ran away. And when I got downstairs, oh, how I cried! It almost seemed to me that I had lost my Ada for ever. I was so lonely and so blank without her, and it was so desolate to be going home with no hope of seeing her there, that I could get no comfort for a little while as I walked up and down in a dim corner, sobbing and crying. I came to myself by and by, after a little scolding, and took a coach home. The poor boy whom I had found at St. Albans had reappeared a short time before, and was lying at the point of death. Indeed, was then dead, though I did not know it. My guardian had gone to inquire about him, and did not return to dinner. Being quite alone, I cried a little again, though on the whole I don't think I behaved so very, very ill. It's only natural that I should not be quite accustomed to the loss of my darling yet. 3 or 4 hours were not a long time after years, but my mind dwelt so much upon the uncongenial scene in which I had left her, and I pictured it as such an overshadowed, stony-hearted one, and so I longed to be near her and taking some sort of care of her, that I determined to go back in the evening only to look up at her windows. It was foolish, I dare say, but it did not seem so at all to me, and it does not seem quite so even now. I took Charlie into my confidence, and we went out at dusk. It was dark when we came to the new strange home of my dear girl, and there was a light behind the yellow blinds. We walked past cautiously 3 or 4 times, looking up, and narrowly missed encountering Mr. Vholes, who came out of his office while we were there, and turned his head to look up too before going home. The sight of his lank black figure and the lonesome air of that nook in the dark were favourable to the state of my mind. I thought of the youth and love and beauty of my dear girl, shut up in such an ill-assorted refuge, almost as if it were a cruel place. It was very solitary and very dull. I did not doubt that I might safely steal upstairs. I left Charlie below and went up with a light foot, not distressed by any glare from the feeble oil lanterns on the way. I listened for a few moments, and in the musty, rotting silence of the house believed that I could hear the murmur of their young voices. I put my lips to the hearse-like panel of the door with a kiss for my dear, and came quietly down again, thinking that one of these days I would confess to the visit. It really did me good, for though nobody but Charlie and I knew anything about it, I somehow felt as if it had diminished the separation between Ada and me, and had brought us together again for those few moments. I went back, not quite accustomed yet to change, but all the better for that hovering about my darling. My guardian had come home, was standing thoughtfully by the dark window. When I went in, his face cleared, and he came to his seat, but he caught the light upon my face as I took mine. "Little woman," said he, "you've been crying." "Oh yes, guardian," said I. "I'm afraid I have been a little. Ada has been in such distress, and is so very sorry, guardian." I put my arm on the back of his chair, and I saw in his glance that my words and my look at an empty place had prepared him. "Is she married, my dear?" I told him all about it, and how her first entreaties had referred to his forgiveness. "She has no need of it," said he. "Heaven bless her and her husband. But just as my first impulse had been to pity her, so was his. Poor girl, poor girl, poor Rick, poor Ada." Neither of us spoke after that, until he said with a sigh, "Well, well, my dear, Bleak House is thinning fast." But its mistress remains, guardian. Though I was timid about saying it, I ventured because of the sorrowful tone in which he had spoken. She will do all she can to make it happy, said I. She will succeed, my love. The letter had made no difference between us, except that the seat by his side had come to be mine. It made none now. He turned his old bright fatherly look upon me, laid his hand on my hand in his old way, and said again, "She will succeed, my dear. Nevertheless, Bleak House is thinning fast, O little woman." I was sorry presently that this is all we said about that. I was rather disappointed. I feared I might not quite have been all I had meant to be since the letter and the answer. Chapter 52. Obstinacy. But one other day had intervened, when early in the morning, as we were going to breakfast, Mr. Woodcourt came in haste with the astounding news that a terrible murder had been committed, for which Mr. George had been apprehended and was in custody. When he told us what a large reward was offered by Sir Leicester Dedlock for the murderer's apprehension, I did not, in my first consternation, understand why. But a few more words explained to me that the murdered person was Sir Leicester's lawyer, and immediately my mother's dread of him rushed into my remembrance. This unforeseen and violent removal of one whom she had long watched and distrusted, and who had long watched and distrusted her, one for whom she could have had few intervals of kindness, always dreading in him a dangerous and secret enemy, appeared so awful that my first thoughts were of her. How appalling to hear of such a death and be able to feel no pity! How dreadful to remember, perhaps, that she had sometimes even wished the old man away, who was so swiftly hurried out of life. Such crowding reflections, increasing the distress and fear I always felt when the name was mentioned, made me so agitated that I could scarcely hold my place at the table. I was quite unable to follow the conversation until I had little time to recover. But when I came to myself and saw how shocked my guardian was, and found that they were earnestly speaking of the suspected man, and recalling every favourable impression we had formed of him out of the good we had known of him, my interest and my fears were so strongly aroused in his behalf that I was quite set up again. "Guardian, you don't think it possible that he is justly accused?" "My dear, I can't think so. This man, whom we have seen so open-hearted and compassionate, who, with the might of a giant, has the gentleness of a child, who looks as brave a fellow as ever lived, and is so simple and quiet with it, this man justly accused of such a crime, I can't believe it. It's not that I don't, or I won't, I can't." "And I can't," said Mr. Woodcourt. "Still, whatever we believe or know of him, we had better not forget that some appearances are against him. He bore an animosity towards the deceased gentleman. He has openly mentioned it in many places. He is said to have expressed himself violently towards him, and he certainly did about him to my knowledge. He admits that he was alone on the scene of the murder within a few minutes of its commission. I sincerely believe him to be as innocent of any participation in it as I am, but these are all reasons for suspicion falling upon him." "True," said my guardian, and he added, turning to me, "it would be doing him a very bad service, my dear, to shut our eyes to the truth in any of these respects." I felt, of course, that we must admit, not only to ourselves but to others, the full force of the circumstances against him. Yet I knew withal, I could not help saying, that their weight would not induce us to desert him in his need. "Heaven forbid," returned my guardian. "We will stand by him, as he himself stood by the two poor creatures who are gone." He meant Mr. Gridley and the boy, to both of whom Mr. George had given shelter. Mr. Woodcourt then told us that the trooper's man had been with him before day, after wandering about the streets all night like a distracted creature, that one of the trooper's first anxieties was that we should not suppose him guilty, that he had charged his messenger to represent his perfect innocence with every solemn assurance he could send us, that Mr. Woodcourt had only quieted the man by undertaking to come to our house very early in the morning with these representations. He added that he was now upon his way to see the prisoner himself. My guardian said directly he would go too. Now, beside that I liked the retired soldier very much, and he liked me, I had that secret interest in what had happened which was only known to my guardian. I felt as if it came close and near to me. It seemed to become personally important to myself that the truth should be discovered, and that no innocent people should be suspected, for suspicion, once run wild, might run wilder. In a word, I felt as if it were my duty and obligation to go with them. My guardian did not seek to dissuade me, and I went. It was a large prison with many courts and passages, so like one another and so uniformly paved, that I seemed to gain a new comprehension, as I passed along, of the fondness that solitary prisoners, shut up among the same staring walls from year to year, have had, as I have read, for a weed or a stray blade of grass. In an arched room by himself, like a cellar upstairs, with walls so glaringly white that they made the massive iron window bars and iron-bound door even more profoundly black than they were, we found the trooper standing in a corner. He had been sitting on a bench there, and had risen when he had heard the locks and bolts turn. When he saw us, he came forward a step with his usual heavy tread, and there stopped and made a slight bow. But as I still advanced, putting out my hand to him, he understood us in a moment. "This is a load off my mind, I do assure you, miss and gentlemen," said he, saluting us with great heartiness and drawing a long breath. "And now I don't much care how it ends." He scarcely seemed to be the prisoner. What with his coolness and his soldierly bearing, he looked far more like the prison guard. "This is an even rougher place than my gallery to receive a lady in," said Mr. George, "but I know Miss Summerson will make the best of it." As he handed me to the bench on which he had been sitting, I sat down, which seemed to give him great satisfaction. "I thank you, miss," said he. "Now, George," observed my guardian, "as we require no new assurances on your part, so I believe we need to give you none on ours." "Not at all, sir. I thank you with all my heart. If I was not innocent of this crime, I couldn't look at you and keep my secret to myself under the condescension of the present visit. I feel the present visit very much. I am not one of the eloquent sort, but I feel it, Miss Summerson and gentlemen, deeply." He laid his hands for a moment on his broad chest, and bent his head to us. Although he squared himself again directly, he expressed a great amount of natural emotion by these simple means. "First," said my guardian, "can we do anything for your personal comfort, George?" "For which, sir?" he inquired, clearing his throat. "For your personal comfort. Is there anything you want that would lessen the hardship of this confinement?" "Well, sir," replied George, after a little cogitation, "I am equally obliged to you, but tobacco being against the rules, I can't say that there is." "You will think of many little things, perhaps, by and by. Whenever you do, George, let us know." "Thank you, sir. Howsoever," observed Mr. George, with one of his sunburnt smiles, "a man who has been knocking about the world in a vagabond kind of way as long as I have gets on well enough in a place like the present, so far as that goes." "Next, as to your case," observed my guardian. "Exactly so, sir," returned Mr. George, folding his arms upon his breast with perfect self-possession and a little curiosity. "How does it stand now?" "Why, sir, it's under remand at present. Bucket gives me to understand that he will probably apply for a series of remands from time to time until the case is more complete. How it is to be made more complete I don't myself see, but I dare say Bucket will manage it somehow." "Why, heaven save us, man!" exclaimed my guardian, surprised into his old oddity and vehemence. "You talk of yourself as if you were somebody else." "No offence, sir," said Mr. George. "I am very sensible of your kindness, but I don't see how an innocent man is to make up his mind to this kind of thing without knocking his head against the walls, unless he takes it in that point of view." "That is true enough to a certain extent," returned my guardian, softened. "But, my good fellow, even an innocent man must take ordinary precautions to defend himself." "Certainly, sir, and I have done so. I have stated to the magistrates, 'Gentlemen, I am as innocent of this charge as yourselves. What has been stated against me in the way of facts is perfectly true. I know no more about it.'" "I intend to continue stating that, sir. What more can I do? It's the truth." "But the mere truth won't do," rejoined my guardian. "Won't it indeed, sir? Rather a bad look out for me," Mr. George good humouredly observed. "You must have a lawyer," persuaded my guardian. "You must engage a good one for you." "I ask your pardon, sir," said Mr. George, with a step backward. "I am equally obliged, but I must decidedly beg to be excused from anything of that sort." "You won't have a lawyer?" No, sir. Mr. George shook his head in the most emphatic manner. I thank you all the same, sir, but no lawyer. Why not? I don't take kindly to the breed, said Mr. George. Gridley didn't, and if you'll excuse me saying so much, I should hardly have thought that you did yourself, sir. That's equity, my guardian explained, a little at a loss. That's equity, George. Is it indeed, sir? Returned the trooper in his offhand manner. I'm not acquainted with those shades of names myself, but in a general way I object to the breed. Unfolding his arms and changing his position, he stood with one massive hand upon the table and the other on his hip, as complete a picture of a man who was not to be moved from a fixed purpose as I ever saw. It was in vain that we all three talked to him and endeavoured to persuade him, but was evidently no more shaken by our representations than his place of confinement was. Pray think once more, Mr. George, said I. Have you no wish in reference to your case? I certainly wish it could be tried, miss, he returned, by court-martial, but that's out of the question, as I am well aware. If you would be so good as to favour me with your attention for a couple of minutes, miss, not more, I'll endeavour to explain myself as clearly as I can. He looked at us all three in turn, shook his head a little, as if he were adjusting it in the stock and collar of a tight uniform, and after a moment's reflection went on. You see, miss, I've been handcuffed and taken into custody and brought here. I am a marked and disgraced man. And here I am. My shooting gallery is rummaged high and low by bucket. Such property as I have, 'tis small, is turned this way and that till it don't know itself. And, as aforesaid, here I am. I don't particularly complain of that, though I am in these present quarters through no immediately preceding fault of mine. I can very well understand that if I hadn't gone into the vagabond way in my youth, this wouldn't have happened. It has happened. Then comes the question of how to meet it. Now, the unfortunate deceased was himself a lawyer, and had a pretty tight hold of me. I don't wish to rake up his ashes, but he had, what I should call, if he was living, a devil of a tight hold on me. I don't like his trade the better for that. If I had kept clear of his trade, I should have been kept outside this place. But that's not what I mean. Now, suppose I had killed him. Suppose I really had discharged into his body any one of those pistols recently fired off that Bucket has found at my place, and, dear me, might have found there any day since it has been my place. What should I have done as soon as I was hard and fast here? Got a lawyer? He stopped on hearing someone at the locks and bolts, and did not resume till the door had been opened and was shut again. For what purpose opened I will mention presently. I should have got a lawyer, and he would have said, as I have often read in the newspapers, my client says nothing, my client reserves his defence, my client this, that, the other. Well, it's not the custom of that breed to go straight, according to my opinion, or to think that other men do. Say I am innocent and I get a lawyer. He would be as likely to believe me guilty as not, perhaps more. What would he do? Whether or not, act as if I was? Shut my mouth up, tell me not to commit myself, keep circumstances back, chop the evidence, quibble and get me off, perhaps. But, Miss Summerson, do I care for getting off in that way, or would I rather be hanged in my own way, if you'll excuse my mentioning anything so disagreeable to a lady? He had warmed to his subject now, and was under no further necessity to wait a bit. I would rather be hanged in my own way, and I mean to be. I don't intend to say, looking round upon us with his powerful arms akimbo and his dark eyebrows raised, that I am more partial to being hanged than another man. What I say is, I must come off clear and full, or not at all. Therefore, when I hear stated against me what is true, I say it's true, and when they tell me whatever you say will be used, I'll tell them I don't mind that. I mean it to be used. If they can't make me innocent out of the whole truth, they are not likely to do it out of anything less, or anything else, and if they are, it's worth nothing to me. Taking a pace or two over the stone floor, he came back to the table and finished what he had to say. I thank you, miss, and gentlemen both, many times for your attention, and many times more for your interest. That's the plain state of the matter as it points itself out to a mere trooper with a blunt broadsword kind of mind. I have never done well in life beyond my duty as a soldier, and if the worst comes after all, I shall reap pretty much as I have sown. When I got over the first crash of being seized as a murderer, It don't take a rover who is knocked about so much as myself so very long to recover from a crash. I worked my way round to what you find me now. As such I shall remain. No relations will be disgraced by me, or made unhappy for me. And that's all I've got to say." The door had been opened to admit another soldier-looking man, of less prepossessing appearance at first sight, and a weather-tanned, bright-eyed, wholesome woman with a basket, who from her entrance had been exceedingly attentive to all Mr. George had said. Mr. George had received them with a familiar nod and a friendly look, but without any more particular greeting in the midst of his address. He now shook them cordially by the hand and said, "Miss Summerson and gentlemen, this is an old comrade of mine, Matthew Bagnet, and this is his wife, Mrs. Bagnet." Mr. Bagnet made us a stiff military bow, and Mrs. Bagnet dropped us a curtsy. "Real good friends of mine they are," said Mr. George. "It was at their house I was taken." "With a second-hand violoncello," Mr. Bagnet put in, twitching his head angrily. "Of good tone for a friend. The money was no object, too." "Matt," said Mr. George, "you have heard pretty well all I have been saying to this lady and these two gentlemen. I know it meets your approval." Mr. Bagnet, after considering, referred the point to his wife. "Old girl," said he, "tell him whether or not it meets my approval." "Why, George," exclaimed Mrs. Bagnet, who had been unpacking a basket in which there was a piece of cold pickled pork, a little tea and sugar, and a brown loaf, "you ought to know it, don't you? Ought to know it's enough to drive a person wild to hear you. You won't be got off this way, and you won't be got off that way. What do you mean by such picking and choosing? It's stuff and nonsense, George." "Don't be severe upon me in my misfortunes, Mrs. Bagnet," said the trooper lightly. "Oh, bother your misfortunes," cried Mrs. Bagnet, "if they don't make you more reasonable than that comes to. I was never so ashamed in my life to hear a man talk folly as I've been to hear you talk this day to the present company. Lawyers? Why, but what so many cooks should hinder you from having a dozen lawyers, if the gentlemen recommend them to you." "This is a very sensible woman," said my guardian. "I'll hope you'll persuade him, Mrs. Bagnet." "Persuade him, sir," she returned. "Lord bless you, no, you don't know George. Now there." Mrs. Bagnet left her basket to point him out with both her bare brown hands. "There he stands, as self-willed and a determined man in the wrong way as ever put a human creature under heaven out of patience. You could as soon take up and shoulder an 8 and 40 pounder by your own strength as turn that man when he has got a thing in his head and fixed it there." "Why, don't I know him?" cried Mrs. Bagnet. "Don't I know you, George? Don't you mean to set up for a new character with me after all these years, I hope?" Her friendly indignation had an exemplary effect upon her husband, who shook his head at the trooper several times as a silent recommendation to him to yield. Between whiles Mrs. Bagnet looked at me, and I understood from the play of her eyes that she wished me to do something, though I did not comprehend what. "But I've given up talking to you, old fellow, years and years," said Mrs. Bagnet, as she blew a little dust off the pickled pork, looking at me again. "And when ladies and gentlemen know you as well as I do, they'll give up talking to you too. If you're not too headstrong to accept a bit of dinner, here it is." "I accept it with many thanks," returned the trooper. "Do you, though, indeed?" said Mrs. Bagnet, continuing to grumble on good humouredly. "So I'm sure I'm surprised at that. I wonder you don't starve in your own way also. It would only be like you. Perhaps you'll set your mind upon that next." Here she looked at me, and now I perceived from her glances at the door and at me by turns that she wished us to retire and to await her following us outside the prison. Communicating this by similar means to my guardian and Mr. Woodcourt, I rose. "We hope you will think better of it, Mr. George," said I, "and we shall come to see you again, trusting to find you more reasonable." "More grateful, Miss Summerson, you can't find me," he returned. "But more persuadable we can, I hope," said I. "And let me entreat you to consider that the clearing up of this mystery and the discovery of the real perpetrator of this deed may be one of the last importance to others besides yourself." But he heard me respectfully, but without much heeding these words, which I spoke a little turned from him, already on my way to the door. He was observing, this they afterwards told me, my height and figure, which seemed to catch his attention all at once. "'Tis curious," said he, "yet I thought so at the time." My guardian asked him what he meant. "Why, sir," he answered, "when my ill fortune took me to the dead man's staircase on the night of his murder, I saw a shape so like Miss Summerson's go by me in the dark that I had half a mind to speak to it. For an instant I felt such a shudder as I had never felt before or since, and hope I shall never feel again." "It came downstairs as I went up," said the trooper, "and crossed the moonlighted window with a loose black mantle on. I noticed a deep fringe to it. However, it has nothing to do with the present subject, excepting that Miss Summerson looked so like it at the moment that it came into my head. I cannot separate and define the feelings that arose in me after this. It is enough that the vague duty and obligation I had felt upon me from the first following the investigation was, without my distinctly daring to ask myself any question, increased, and that I was indignantly sure of there being no possibility of a reason for my being afraid. We three went out of the prison and walked up and down at some short distance from the gate, which was in a retired place. We had not waited long when Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet came out too and quickly joined us. There was a tear in each of Mrs. Bagnet's eyes, and her face was flushed and hurried. "I didn't let George see what I thought about it, you know, miss," was her first remark when she came up. "But he's in a bad way, poor old fellow." "Not with care and prudence and good help," said my guardian. "A gentleman like you ought to know best, sir," returned Mrs. Bagnet, hurriedly drying her eyes on the hem of her grey cloak. "But I am uneasy for him. He has been so careless, and said so much that he never meant. The gentlemen of the juries might not understand him as Lingnam and me do. And then such a number of circumstances have happened bad for him, and such a number of people will be brought forward to speak against him, and Bucket is so deep." "With a second-hand violoncello, and said he played the fife when a boy," Mr. Bagnet answered with great solemnity. "Now I tell you, miss," said Mrs. Bagnet, "and when I say miss I mean all. Just come into the corner of the wall and I'll tell you." Mrs. Bagnet hurried us into a more secluded place, and was at first too breathless to proceed, occasioning Mr. Bagnet to say, "Old girl, tell 'em." "Why then, miss," the old girl proceeded, untying the strings of her bonnet for more air, "you could as soon move Dover Castle as move George on this point, unless you had got a new power to move him with, and I have got it." "You are a jewel of a woman," said my guardian. "Go on." "Now I tell you, miss," she proceeded, clapping her hands in her hurry and agitation a dozen times in every sentence, "that what he says concerning no relations is all bosh. They don't know of him, but he does know of them. He has said more to me at odd times than to anybody else, and it weren't for nothing that he once spoke to my Woolwich about whitening and wrinkling mothers' heads. For £50 he had seen his mother that day. She is alive and must be brought here straight." Instantly Mrs. Bagnet put some pins into her mouth and began pinning up her skirts all round a little higher than the level of her grey cloak, which she accomplished with surpassing dispatch and dexterity. "Lignum," said Mrs. Bagnet, "you take care of the children, old man, and give me the umbrella. I'm away to Lincolnshire to bring that old lady here." "Bless the woman!" cried my guardian with his hand in his pocket. "How is she going? What money has she got?" Mrs. Bagnet made another application to her skirts, and brought forth a leathern purse, which she hastily counted out a few shillings, which she then shut up with perfect satisfaction. "Never you mind for me, miss. I'm a soldier's wife, and accustomed to travel my own way. Lignum, old boy, kissing him, 1 for yourself, 3 for the children. Now I'm away to Lincolnshire after George's mother." And she actually set off while we three stood looking at one another, lost in amazement. She actually trudged away in her grey cloak at a sturdy pace, and turned the corner and was gone. "Mr. Bagnet," said my guardian, "do you mean to let her go in that way?" "Can't help it," he returned. "Made her way home once from another quarter of the world with the same grey cloak and the same umbrella. Whatever the old girl says, do it. Whenever the old girl says, I'll do it, she does it." "Then she is as honest and genuine as she looks," rejoined my guardian, "and it is impossible to say more for her." "She's colour sergeant of the Nonpareil battalion," said Mr. Bagnet, looking at us over his shoulder as he went his way also, "and there's not such another. But I'll never own to it before her. Discipline must be maintained."